Chapter 6 Mystery Man. Plato and Jack hurried past the crowd standing at the sides of the racetrack. Everyone was shouting and cheering. "I have seats next to the judges," said Plato. He pointed to a tall stand with rows of benches. Plato led Jack through the crowd and up the steps to their seats. "Wow, thanks," said Jack. He had a great view. The Olympic parade had already started. Musicians playing pipes were at the front. Behind them marched the Olympic athletes, the best in all of Greece. Jack sighed as he watched the parade going around the track. "Annie would really love this," he thought. "The athletes in front are the runners," said Plato. "Foot races are the oldest event of the Olympics." Jack pulled out his notebook and wrote, "Oldest event is foot races." "Behind the runners are the boxers. They're wearing special gloves and bronze helmets." Jack wrote, "Boxers wear gloves and helmets." "Behind them are the wrestlers," said Plato, and Jack wrote, "wrestlers." When Jack looked up again, he saw a soldier staring up at him from the sidelines. The soldier was dressed like the actor from the outdoor theater. He had a long cape and a red crested helmet that covered most of his face. But something was strange. The soldier was short, really short. "Here come the discus and javelin throwers," said Plato, "and then the men in armor." "What do they do?" asked Jack. "They race wearing full armor," said Plato. Jack smiled to himself. He knew Annie would think that was funny. He wrote in his notebook, "Some runners race in armor." Jack finished writing. He looked back at the short soldier. "In a moment, the chariot races will begin," said Plato. "Winning a chariot race is the greatest honor of the games." Jack just nodded. He was still studying the short soldier, who seemed to be looking back at him. Suddenly, a small hand came out from the soldier's cape. The hand gave a little wave. Jack gasped. It was Annie waving. The short soldier was Annie. Chapter 7 Go, Go, Go. Jack stared in horror at Annie. She must have borrowed a costume from the theater. He remembered Plato's words. A girl will get in terrible trouble if she tries to attend the Olympic Games. Jack shook his head at her and pointed his finger as if to say, "Get out of here." But Annie just waved at him again. Jack kept shaking his head at Annie. He even shook his fist. Annie turned back to watch the race. "It's not a joke!" Jack shouted. Plato turned and looked at him. "Of course not," said Plato. "We take the games very seriously." Jack felt his face grow hot. He glared at Annie's back. Just then the trumpets sounded. "The chariots are taking their places," said Plato. Jack saw the dozens of chariots lined up on the racetrack. Each chariot was pulled by 4 horses. Jack glanced back at Annie. She was looking up at him, pointing at the chariots. The trumpet sounded off again. The horses took off. The crowd went wild. They were cheering and screaming and stamping their feet. Clouds of dust rose up as the chariots raced around the track. Annie turned back to watch the race. She began jumping up and down. "Go, go, go!" she shouted. A few people began staring at the strange small soldier with the high-pitched voice. Jack couldn't take it anymore. He had to get Annie away before it was too late. He shoved his notebook into his pack. "I have to go," he shouted to Plato. The philosopher looked puzzled. Jack was afraid to tell him that Annie had broken the rules. "I had a great time, but I have to go home now. Thanks for everything." "Have a safe journey," said Plato. Jack waved and started down the steps. As he climbed down, he saw Annie pull off her helmet. Her pigtails flew up and down as she jumped and shouted, "Go, go, go!" Her soldier's cape fell off. Now, lots of people were staring at her. Someone shouted for the guards. Annie was too busy cheering to notice anything. Jack moved as quickly as he could, but 2 big guards got to Annie first. Chapter 8 Save Annie. The guards tried to pull Annie away from the chariot race. Annie looked surprised. Then she looked angry. "Let go of me!" she shouted. Jack rushed down the steps of the viewing stand. The guards were having a hard time pulling Annie through all the people. "Leave her alone!" Jack yelled. His voice was lost in the noise of the race. He pushed his way through the crowd. "Leave her alone!" he kept shouting. "Leave her alone!" Finally, Jack reached Annie and the guards. He tried to grab her, but a guard blocked his way. "Let her go! I promise I'll take her home!" More guards arrived. The crowds began shouting. "Arrest her! Arrest her!" The guards kept pulling Annie away. "Jack, the story!" cried Annie. "Of course," thought Jack. "The poet's story! This is definitely our darkest hour!" He reached into his bag and pulled out the poet's scroll. He held the story up to the sky. "Save Annie!" he shouted. But Jack's voice was again lost in the roar of the race as the 4-horse chariots barreled through the dust. Jack looked around wildly for someone or something to help. Then suddenly, the crowd fell silent. All heads turned to watch as a huge white horse galloped out of the dust. The crowd murmured with excitement and wonder. The white horse was the most beautiful animal Jack had ever seen. He was pulling an empty chariot, and he was galloping straight toward Jack. Chapter 9. Fly Away Home. The white horse stopped at the low wall by the edge of the track. "He's come for us!" cried Annie. The guards stared in awe at the horse. Annie broke free and dashed over to Jack. He grabbed her hand and they ran to the horse. The guards shouted and started after them, but they were too late. Jack and Annie had already climbed over the wall and into the waiting chariot. "Go, go, go!" Annie cried to the huge white horse. The horse reared and pawed the air. The crowd stepped back from the wall. The guards froze. Jack looked up to where Plato was now standing. Plato smiled and waved at him. Then the white horse leaped forward, pulling the chariot behind him. Jack couldn't even wave back at Plato. All he could do was hold on tight as the horse galloped beside the Olympic racers. Jack bounced up and down. Dust and sand got in his eyes. He squeezed them shut and crouched down in the chariot. He didn't know where they were going, but it didn't matter. The white horse was in charge. Jack heard the thundering noise of the racing horse and the chariots. He heard the screaming crowd. He felt sand blowing in his face and the hard bumping and rattling of the chariot. Suddenly he was thrown backward. He heard a swoosh of wind, then silence. "Oh, wow!" cried Annie. Jack opened his eyes. All he saw was pale blue sky. He pushed his glasses into place and looked around. "Help!" he cried. The white horse had grown giant, feathery wings and was pulling their chariot into the sky. Jack gripped the railing of the chariot and held on for his life. "To the treehouse!" shouted Annie. Below, the Olympic crowd watched in stunned silence. The winged horse left the games behind and flew over the temple of Zeus, over the statue of Nike, over the sacred olive tree, and the gymnasium. On they went, over the poet's house, the Greek theater, and the field of white tenants. Finally, the winged horse coasted to the ground near the olive grove. The wheels of the chariot bumped onto the grass. Then slowly, slowly they came to a stop. Jack and Annie stepped out of the chariot. Jack's legs were so wobbly he could hardly walk. Annie rushed to the horse and stroked his neck. "Thank you," she whispered. Jack patted the horse's long white neck too. "Thanks," he said. "That was the best ride of my life." The horse snorted and pawed the ground. "Come on, Annie. We have to go before they find us," said Jack. "I don't want to leave him," said Annie. "He's the most beautiful horse in the whole world." Her eyes filled with tears. "We have to," said Jack. The horse put his head down and touched Annie's forehead with his soft nose. Then he gave her a gentle push toward the treehouse. Annie sniffled, but started walking. Jack took her hand as they walked through the olive grove to the rope ladder of the treehouse. "You first," Jack said. Annie started up the ladder. Jack followed. When they were inside, Annie hurried to the window. Jack grabbed the Pennsylvania book. He waved to a picture of Frog Creek Woods and said, "I wish—" "Look!" said Annie. Jack looked out the window. The horse had spread his great feathery wings. He was rising from the field. The white horse flew high into the blue Olympian sky. Then he disappeared behind the clouds. "Bye," called Annie. A tear rolled down her cheek. Jack pointed again at the Pennsylvania book. "I wish we could go there," he said. The wind started to blow. The tree house began to spin. It spun faster and faster. Then everything was still. Absolutely still.